Good afternoon, everybody from Harvard University. I'm Xavier Briggs of the Ford Foundation, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's release of the State of the Nation's Housing Report by the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies. The Joint Center has been producing this report annually since 1988, and it's become an extremely important resource for the housing industry, for policymakers, and for the public conversation, and for advocates across the country. Today we're here to talk about the findings of the report and their implications. And we've got a fantastic panel. I want to introduce them quickly. To my right, Chris Herbert is Research Director of Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies and one of the lead authors of this year's report. Next, we've got Darrell Carter. Darrell, welcome. Darrell is Chairman of the National Multifamily Housing Council, as well as the founder, Chairman, and CEO of Avanith. Did I say it right?
Yes, you did.
Avanith Capital Management, which is an investment firm managing affordable multifamily housing, urban real estate, and commercial and multifamily mortgages. To his right is Lisa Sturdivant, Director of the Center for Housing Policy and Vice President for Research at the National Housing Conference, a nonprofit dedicated to helping ensure safe, decent, affordable housing for everyone in America. And finally, we've got Mike Calhoun. Mike, welcome. Mike is President of the Center for Responsible Lending. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works to protect homeownership and family wealth and provides information to consumers, community advocates, and policymakers. So welcome to you all, and thank you for being with us today. Before we jump to this year's big findings and what they mean for all of us, I want to acknowledge the Joint Center's Managing Director, Eric Belsky, and Research Manager Dan McHugh for the roles they played in developing this year's report. And I want to remind those of you who are watching online that you can send us questions. You can tweet us questions using the hashtag Harvard Housing Report, and we'll take a few of your questions later in the webcast. Chris, let's start with you. There's been a steady drumbeat of bad news on the housing market coming out this spring. And just this week, we got some chilling news, if you will, about the first quarter for the economy as a whole. Not what we'd like it to be. But lately, there have been positive signs as well, especially about housing. Help us make sense of it. What path should we expect the housing recovery to take from here?
That's a great question, Zav. You know, the GDP number that just came out was really quite shocking to have that much loss in the first quarter. But all indications are really that that was strongly weather-related, and I think analysts expect the second quarter to get back on track. And in fact, some of the news that came out this week about the housing market really showed that there's some positivity. But the prognosis for the housing recovery really is quite important, and it's important not just for all the households and families who have really suffered through this downturn, many millions of whom are still underwater and waiting to get back in the black, but it's also important for the broader economy. Housing really traditionally plays a really strong role in driving the economy out of a recession, and here we are 6 years later and it's still yet to do that. And the economy as a result, I think, is still not really on very strong footing as a result. So where are we in this recovery is a key question. Over the past year, I would say the housing market threw us a kind of double head fake. And last year, we could go back to where we were in the spring. We were actually seeing the housing market starting to increase at a much more rapid pace than it had previously. Sales were up, starts were up, housing prices were certainly up. And I think that led to expectations that maybe housing really was starting to find another gear and play that role. And then fast forward to the second half of the year, and we find all the indicators really started to slow, and then the winter hit. And the numbers from the first quarter were really dismal. A lot of numbers that are down in terms of sales and construction. So what do we make of that? You know, I think the double fake that we saw really was largely driven by what happened with interest rates. If we look last spring, we had mortgage rates that were down to the low threes. We hadn't really seen that rate before ever. And so when you have that level of stimulus, I think we really started to get the market ramped up, and we're thinking that that was a fundamental recovery when it wasn't. And the second half, likewise, I think it was when those rates shot up by a point after the Fed announced their decision to pull back, that really took the wind out of the sails of the market. So where we're left now is basically we're back to this steady, slow recovery that reflects what's happening in the underlying economy. The key thing for the housing market is jobs. Jobs translate into household formation. Household formation translates into growth in the housing stock. And what we've had, good news and bad news, is we've actually had through this period job growth continue at about 200,000 a month. And so that's helping to kind of keep that underlying fundamental level of demand coming along. It's still pretty anemic, and so I think as long as the economy follows that path, so will the housing market. one other caveat too, and we've been saying this all along, I think we lost sight of it last year, was that we have a lot of hangover left over from the crash, and we have to work through those as well. Chief among those, I think, are underwater homeowners. And in the past year, with house price growth that we've had, we've seen a really significant decline. CoreLogic estimates that went from a little more than 10 million to less than 7 million people underwater. And I think we made up a lot more progress than we ever thought we would in a short period of time, but it's still almost 7 million homeowners. And Zillow pegs it over closer to 10 million. So with that many people stuck in their homes, struggling to make their payments, they're not buyers, they're not sellers, that's really a big glue in the market. And the second thing to not lose sight of is the fact that even though we've seen a big recovery in the people who are struggling to make their mortgage payments, seriously delinquent or facing foreclosure, it's come down by half from where it was. It's still twice what it was in the normal times. So if we're going to get back to normal, this pace of economic growth is key, but we also still have to work off those problems and not lose sight of the fact that we still have work to do to solve those.
Got it. So that really gives us a clearer picture. But let's talk about what it would take to produce a stronger recovery. In the report, you really emphasize the role of millennials, which stood out for me. We've been hearing a lot about the challenges that young adults are facing in the job market and financial challenges, and challenges that are keeping many of them from moving out on their own, which gets right to the point you were making. I was struck by this figure from the report. It shows the jump in the number of 20-somethings living with their parents in recent years. You note in the report that given these increases, there are now more than 2 million 20-year-olds still at home rather than looking for their own place to live. So what are the prospects for millennials to get a stronger foothold in the housing market?
You know, people ask, well, why are the millennials so important? And the truth is that young people are always important in the housing market, because it's young people who are starting out in life who are the ones who are adding incrementally to housing demand. As they move out on their own, seek an apartment, ultimately many will seek a home, they are the ones who are adding to that supply of housing. And they're also important because they allow other moves up the housing market. So if I'm someone looking to trade up, I've got to find another first-time buyer to take my home before I can move. And so we're looking at as millennials to really play that key role in moving the market. Now, the other reason the millennials are important is because of the fact that they're a bigger generation than any other generation we've had of this size. They're bigger than the baby boom at the same point. And if you think back a generation when the baby boom hit the market, and their impact on the housing market was tremendous. Now, the millennials are following generations that were, the baby boom came after the Depression generation, so they had a bigger impact. But still, this is a large group. And the other thing about them is they're coming of age during the worst recession since the Great Depression. And if you think about millennials born between the mid-'80s and the early 2000s, they were just becoming 21, 22 when the recession hit. So just when you're starting to get out there and get a foothold in life, they're hit by this recession. And their unemployment rates went up to 16% of those aged 20 to 24. From 8%, it doubled to 16%. And so if you're looking at those figures in terms of how many people are living at home, it's no surprise that if you're 20 to 24, more people are living at home when they can't get that financial independence that they need. The good news is that we're starting to see some recovery. It's not enough again. Their unemployment rate is down to 11%. It's actually down a point just since the beginning of the year. So there's some indications that maybe the job market is starting to recover for those millennials, and that will certainly, start to help getting them that independence they need. Now, the other thing we talk about in the report is that people say, well, they're living at home, maybe they're getting comfortable there in mom and dad's basement, or maybe they're going to stay. Why wouldn't you? And I think that we really have not seen any cultural shift yet in the people's desire to be independent. If you read the accounts, the New York Times had a great piece this week looking at millennials, and they're talking about these young people, and to a one, they're all saying that they really would rather not be there. And one of the things we see in the report is that by the time you get to be in your early 30s, the share of people living at home really comes down. So I think that drive to be independent is still there. I think you need the job to get there. And if we look at what we project over the next 10 years, we see a growth of 30-somethings of 2.7 million over what we have today. That's a key group. It's going to drive the demand for apartments, it's going to drive the demand for starter homes, and really give the housing market a boost. The other thing, though, with millennials is they are facing some significant challenges other than just the job market. And the big one that we hear a lot about and we talk about in the report, too, is the student debt issue. Over the last 10 years, we've seen tremendous rise in student debt outstanding. Our own analysis shows that people aged 25 to 34, the share with student debt went from 26% to 39% by 2010. That's the last count we have. But if you look at bigger statistics, looking at the overall market, student debt has gone up by another 50% since 2010. So that share with debt is no doubt well into the 40%. So half of young people now are juggling student debt, where 10 years ago it was more like a quarter. So when you're sitting there and you're trying to say, I got to pay rent, I got to pay my student loan debt, it's hard to save, it's hard to qualify for a mortgage. So I think that student loan debt, we're still getting a handle on it, but I think it's clearly something that's going to hold them back. But bottom line, I think, is that the millennials, as big as they are, and when the job market recovers and their incomes recover, I think they are going to make their mark on this housing market.
They're going to be critical drivers, given the size of that generation.
Exactly.
Yep. Let me turn to Daryl here. You know, the report describes how the rental market has in fact been in a full-scale recovery for the last 4 years. Daryl, how important have the millennials or other groups been in driving the strong demand for rental housing that we've been seeing?
Well, I think the millennials have been really important, but I think there's strength amongst a variety of sectors. Believe it or not, the baby boomers, you know, there's the number of renters that are baby boomers is increasing. We own properties that are over 55, and, you know, the occupancies are very, very strong there. The other segment that we see are families. You know, we have 10 apartment communities that have 4 bedrooms. 4 bedrooms, the demand for that is just incredible. I mean, we have very few properties, 4 bedrooms that turn over, and the demand is equally strong in 3 bedrooms. So while everyone talks a little bit about the millennials and the impact that they have, you know, we see that, you know, families that, you know, maybe even the prime ownership age, or you know, there's a tremendous amount of demand for rental housing, and so, you know, and the other thing, we own primarily affordable communities, and you know, and I know we'll get into the affordability issues, but there is just almost unlimited demand for more affordable housing. I mean, we are just so underserved in this country by affordable rentals, and you know, our occupancies today are somewhere around 98%. So it's just basically move-out occupancy. You know, we have waiting lists, and when someone moves out, we have a renter ready to move in because there is so much demand, particularly in the higher cost markets on the 2 coasts where we operate in DC, New York, and California, but also in places like Indianapolis, Detroit, and Chicago, where we own property as well. So, you know, this is kind of the golden age for as an apartment owner and an investor. This is the golden age, but certainly, you know, we are challenged by income growth because it continues to be flat. I mean, that's the one thing that we see, that particularly on affordable, as we recertify our residents, you know, their incomes are not growing. And it's one of the challenges, because a lot of apartment owners and investors, they're projecting these rental increases that I think will be, you know, we may be challenged to get.
So something to be careful about.
Absolutely.
I think we've got a chart on this just showing the point you made, that households across the spectrum have fueled a tremendous growth in rental demand. That's tremendously important. You know, but I want to ask you about construction and the boom in construction. On the strength of this surge that we've seen, driven by households of many types, construction of multifamily rentals is now, if I have this right, it's now back to levels last seen in the late 1990s. It's really been quite a while since we've seen this construction boom. Do you worry at all about overbuilding? Is there any danger that some markets, builders are going to overshoot the mark and we'll end up with more units than we need right now?
I think in a few markets, I think one needs to be cautious in, maybe DC, Austin, and Houston. But, you know, keep in context that we lose about 100,000 units a year for obsolescence, and those are primarily at the lower end of the market. We also went through a period of 5 or 6 years with deliveries under 100,000. And so to serve the projected demand, we need about 300,000 a year of new apartment construction. This year we'll deliver somewhere under 200,000. And so, you know, I think that the supply and demand, you know, situation is fairly balanced. The real issue is what we're building, and, you know, unfortunately, the cost to develop today, you know, new construction costs are $250,000 to $500,000 a unit. And the number of renters that can afford that level of cost is really a challenge. I mean, yeah, everyone wants the Google worker that, you know, makes 6 figures, but there's only a few of them. And the bulk of, you know, particularly the millennials, you know, they're starting off at much lower salaries. So The issue is both the you know, the cost of the building new buildings and what the landlords need to get, but also the type of units. You'll see a lot of 1 and 2 bedrooms built targeting for the millennials when in fact there's a lot of demand for family units. So that's, you know, I think that generally the supply and demand conditions are balanced, but you know, again, just to be cautious in certain markets and then be mindful of the economics of the renter versus the rents that they have to pay.
You know, on that note, you made a few points about affordability. I want to get Lisa in here. We've arguably had an affordability crisis for some time now, and one could call it a quiet crisis in that it doesn't tend to garner the media attention, arguably, that it should, or the pressure, frankly, for the policy response that the country could use. But this year's report has some really astonishing figures. So half of all renters in this country pay what the federal government considers unaffordable rents, more than 30% of their income for housing. That's up, according to the report, it's up a full 12 percentage points from what was already a pretty high level a decade ago. Even more striking to me was the fact that 27%, so more than a quarter of all renters, are paying more than 50% of their income for rent. Let's see that map. We've got an affordability map for the country. Lisa, what's driving these trends?
Yeah, you make a great point. I mean, it's striking. This is 20 million renting households that are cost burdened, or 10 million that are paying more than half of their income on rent. And part of the driver is, as we've seen, rising rents because of increased demand from the millennials and the baby boomers, but also from folks who might have been homeowners in the past, but are left out of the homeownership market because of credit or other issues. We've also seen a constraint in supply in recent years. But there's this income issue that's been mentioned, and it's really important to talk about because incomes have really been stagnant over the last few years. And so while we used to think about affordability as something that affected low-income families, it's really moving up the economic ladder where middle-class families in these places that are growing are having a hard time finding housing they can afford. And when we look at this economic recovery that we're in right now, we're in the midst of an economic restructuring, right? So we recently gained back all the jobs we lost during the recession, but we've traded some higher wage jobs for lower wage service sector jobs, particularly on the manufacturing side. We've done this trade-off that is bigger than the recovery and bigger than the income trends in of themselves. And so this has made working households have a harder and harder time finding housing that they can afford, that they can spend less than 30% of their income on. As the map shows, the affordability challenges that you mentioned vary considerably across the country. The darker parts of the map there show where affordability challenges are the most severe. These are places that, frankly, are where the economy has recovered fastest during, during this last few years. This is where the jobs are, right? This is where the demand for housing has been. This is where people go when they want to benefit from work. And so when you go there and you're able to find a Google job for 6 figures, you have options. But if you're working in a service sector job or you're working in an entry-level job, this is what you're facing when you're going to look for housing. In the middle of the country, you see it's a little bit paler, which suggests that housing affordability isn't as big of a challenge, but this isn't where the jobs are either, right? And a lot of this affordability improvement that we might have seen is due to the fact that homeowners are paying less for housing because they were able to refinance or their home's value has dropped. So it's actually sort of a mixed blessing to see affordability improve in some of these parts in the middle of the country. So, one thing I'll also add too is when you think about housing affordability in some of these high-cost areas, people are having to make trade-offs. So they're having to make trade-offs in terms of long commutes. So you can spend less than 30% of income on housing, but then you're driving an hour each way to work, and so you have those transportation costs. Or they're forced to give up some of their spending on some other necessities like healthcare and childcare. The report specifically calls out how folks who are housing cost burdened spend less on those items. And so this is really a challenge that we're seeing most severely on the coast, but certainly all across the country.
That's really helpful. Chris, we've been talking about rental housing for the most part so far, and I want to ask you to help us do a segue to home ownership. Last year saw the home ownership rate drop for the 9th year in a row. Is there any indication that that decline is going to ebb?
Well, I think the short answer is no. So far, we really have seen the homeownership rate in a pretty steady decline over that period of time. The one indication it might be ebbing is the fact that last year was the smallest decline since 2008. So there's some sense it might be ebbing, but I think that could be a statistical artifact as well. And if you look at the number of homeowner households, what's amazing is obviously the rate suggests fewer people are owning, but we've also been adding households over time. So we could have had some increase in homeowners even with that. But in fact, we have fewer homeowners today than we had 8 years ago, 9 years ago. And it's amazing that we've had any recovery in the owner-occupied market and the single-family market, given that we have fewer owners now than we did then. So I think that we really have been in a very anemic market for owner-occupied housing. There's a lot of talk about the fact that we're getting closer to, we're not yet there, to the rate that is the natural homeownership rate. People point to the fact that the homeownership rate was 64% for much of the 80s into the early 90s before we start this run-up. We've gone from 69 to 65, so we still have a little ways to go. But frankly, that's a very simplistic analysis because homeownership rates differ strongly by age. And we're a much older country now than we were 30 years ago. The baby boom generation has moved from their 30s into their 50s and 60s. And so if we look at age-specific homeownership rates, we've actually, the story is much worse than that national number, as bad as it is pretends. The homeownership rate among people in their 25 to 34 is down 8 points since the peak. It's down 9 points among people 35 to 44. And if you actually go back, we have to go back to 1972 when we started collecting this data to find another low point. Basically, it's the lowest point of homeownership for this group since we started keeping records on this. So to say that we still have further to fall doesn't take into account the fact that our age of our country has changed significantly. So the question is, what's it going to take? When's it going to turn around? And I think there's a number of factors that have contributed to the fall in homeownership rate. I mean, certainly, given what we've experienced, people are much more cognizant and aware and sensitive to the real risks of owning, that you don't just buy a home and you're not going to get wealthy automatically. So I think there's going to be some more wariness, which is a good thing, to go into the decision with your eyes wide open. I think certainly, given the troubles we've had in the housing market the last few years, you would have been hard-pressed to feel confident jumping in 2010 when housing prices had been falling for so long. And certainly, I think, and we'll talk more about this, the fact that credit conditions are so tight nowadays, it makes it much harder for those who do have the ability to get into the market and the desire to do it. But I think one of the things we lose sight of is that we have to go back again to basics. And we've talked a lot about income trends, but I think they're really fundamental to this. There's a figure in the report that shows what's happened to median incomes among people in their 20s and in their 30s over the course of the 90s and the 2000s. And we have this belief, I think, or understanding that the homeownership rate rise that we saw up through 2005 was based on loose and easy credit. But in fact, if you look at this chart, it shows that we had strong income growth through the 90s into the early 2000s. And the homeownership rate trajectory, that increase, was really fundamentally, I think, driven in part by the fact that people were doing better. And since the early 2000s, people are doing worse. And so if you look at what's been happening the last few years, the homeownership rate has really followed those income trends down. So I think before we start worrying about, not that we shouldn't start worrying about, but before we get to the point where these other factors are going to impinge, we have to get to the point where incomes go up. And so I think we can get the economy back to full employment, can get the incomes up. I think there's every indication that people in these age groups do ultimately have the desire to own. And so at that point, the real question will be, now that they've got the incomes up, do they have a mortgage product out there that they can get that will make it possible for them?
Mike, I want to ask you to help us tease out these patterns, since they're so crucial if we want to understand the future of the housing market and the importance of credit. Thanks to the foreclosure crisis, millions lost their homes. Millions more ended up underwater. It's been a significant overhang, as Chris talked about a few minutes ago. Is homeownership, let me start with a general one, is homeownership still a goal that we ought to be encouraging? And if so, what are the main impediments you see to having that opportunity to own your own home?
I think understandably, after you had millions of people lose their homes in the home market and unsustainable mortgages really being at the center of what triggered the whole recession, it's natural for people to question, and there are some who openly say, well, the problem is we just pushed home ownership way too far. The numbers, when you dig into them, as Chris was pointing out, strongly suggest otherwise. And if you look at the surveys out there, people still are very much interested in home ownership. It's more of a capacity issue than a desire issue. And there's still lots of studies showing home ownership is good both for the families and the overall community, providing more stability for communities. And Chris has done interesting work looking at how families fared. The foreclosure rates were horrific, but still, for most families, housing was still a good investment even through the crisis, that they gained significant wealth. And I think it's good that we've disabused people largely the idea that housing is like a dot-com stock investment, a way to get rich quick. Mm-hmm. But it still is the primary way for people to steadily build wealth over their lifetimes. And two other things on that. One, if you look at additional data of what type of loans people got, even lower income borrowers did very well through the crisis if they got 30-year fixed rate mortgages. Mm-hmm. It was the ones who got loan payments that were going to jump way up, had deep teaser rates. Those had multiples higher default rates than people who got the standard mortgage with no payment shock. And those families did extremely well. I think one important thing that we're seeing that's been established is out of the crisis, you had the enactment of very important new mortgage protections for consumers. It is a much, much safer mortgage market for people to go into these days. Before, there were mortgage agreements that MBAs and bankers couldn't tell you what they meant or how the payments would recalculate. Now, one of the very positive signs is in the time since then, we are seeing the 30-year fixed rate mortgage come back as the primary mortgage. People can understand that, and it provides them stability, and it did well even through this incredible crisis that we're just coming out of. So I think the home ownership is still the goal. It's still good for both stable long-term housing and as a way to move into the middle class and build some wealth. And as we'll talk more about, that's particularly important for minority households.
Mm-hmm. Mike, I want to ask you to talk a bit more about that. I mean, so much of the country's demographic growth is among immigrants and people of color. The report indicates, and this also jumped out at me, that by 2025, nearly half of all the households in prime first-time homebuyer age, 25 to 34, will be people of color, nearly half. In that context, and given the gaps we've had historically, the racial gaps in home ownership, shouldn't we be worried about what the credit market is providing right now and whether it's enabling that access that you talked about?
I think that really is the key obstacle right now. We're in sort of this slow step dance where you've got the economy slowly recovering and the housing market, particularly for home ownership and new housing starts, it's often glossed over how grim those numbers are. As Chris indicated, you've seen growth there, but they are from lows that we go back to post-World War II. We got down to levels that we had not seen in this country since the time immediately after the Second World War. And even now, those numbers are only up very modestly. We need, for first-time housing starts, those need to increase probably by another 2/3 to get to what would be normal, not boom levels, but normal growth levels. And it's not there, and credit is really driving it. Mm-hmm. One of the other understandable reactions from the crisis is you had lots of investors, lots of banks lose tens of billions of dollars on mortgages that went bad. And understandably, as one of the prominent bank CEOs said, he never wants to see another delinquent mortgage in his life. But the consequence of that is you write mortgages only to a very thin slice of the market. Mm-hmm. The most pristine credit scores that only the wealthiest households tend to have, and you have significant down payments. But the real thing has been the credit scores, which bankers use to predict what's the chance that this loan can default. And right now, in particular, most mortgages, as people know, right now are coming through the government-insured market. And this was aggravated by the fact that for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they intentionally tightened their credit market and raised their guarantee fees with the hope that that would bring in more private capital. Well, it shrank the market and shifted more of it to FHA, but the private investors are still not ready to come back into the market. There are a number of other factors, if we have time, we can get into that are keeping them on the sidelines. And still is what we've seen is rather than that supposed to crowd in private capital, it shrank this key part of the housing market that is really what is driving here. And for us to see something beyond this very slow improvement that we're seeing in home ownership, it's going to require interventions there that significantly increase that in a responsible way. And the good news is it can be done. That credit can be offered in loans that people will be successful on. But that is, I think, the big obstacle to this single-family housing market moving forward. And going to the other part, this becomes most important when you look at the composition of the new housing market. Right now, about 3/4 of homeowners are white households. If you look at life going forward very quickly, that demographic is going to be almost flipped exactly. If you look at where the new household growth will be over the next 20, 25 years, you're talking about 3/4 of that being minority households, and already in a shorter time frame, in the next 10 years, the prime household home buying period is going to be nearly 50% minority. And that matters not just for those, but that is the beginning of the whole housing pipeline. If somebody wants to move up, they need from a starter house to a larger house, they have to have somebody to sell the starter house to. And that really is holding on to the whole market right now. And finally, you mentioned this home ownership gap, and I think that sort of ties this all together. And there's a good figure in the report here that shows that what we need to happen is for this gap to be shrinking. And exactly the opposite is happening, and this reflects that tightness, I think, in the credit box right now. And it's instead the gap is expanding. And given that even into the crisis, white home ownership rates were about 50% higher than minority home ownership rates. So you started with a significant imbalance, and when you see the growth and what that reflects. So for example, we saw a relatively modest reduction in white home ownership rates through the crisis, about 3%. And remember, they started out above 75. They were peaking at about 76%. So that still is affecting a significant number of households, but still a relatively small part there. If you look, for example, at the African American households, they peaked out at about 49%. Almost half of households got to home ownership. They dropped by 6% though, 6%, which in that smaller share is about 1 in 6 reduction in home ownership in that share. So just a generational loss of wealth and impact of the household. And we have got to turn this around, not just so we're serving everybody, but also everybody's invested in this because, as Chris indicated and others, the whole economy's fate will be profoundly affected by how well we reverse this home ownership gap.
Yep, Mike, seems important to underline that. You're talking about something that's not only crucial from the perspective of the households in terms of access to the opportunity to build wealth and to have the security and the stability that comes with that as we know people of all backgrounds aspire to. But number two, the business case for expanding that credit box, for expanding access to home ownership is extremely important for the country, for the economy going forward. That's what I'm hearing from you.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, good. Well, at this point, folks, I want to turn to questions from Twitter because we do have a few. And Lisa, I want to start with you. Our first question is a really important one. Why isn't more attention paid to the affordability crisis? Going back to rentals for a moment, why isn't there more attention paid to this?
I think I have a couple of thoughts, right? So I think one reason is when we used to think about housing affordability, like I mentioned, it used to be a problem that affected low-income households or low-income families. It's almost like how the housing market crash changed our perspective of what it meant to be in foreclosure. All of a sudden, we knew somebody who was in foreclosure, our neighbor or a family member. When we talk about rental affordability, for so long, it seemed like the problem was concentrated among very low-income families or in certain areas of cities or metropolitan areas. But as the problem has become more widespread, there's been increasing attention paid to it by the media, by public policymakers, because the affordability challenges are moving up the economic ladder. So, I think that's one reason. I think the other reason is a little bit trickier, is that, it's a complicated topic, right? Housing affordability has to do with the cost of housing, but also with the wages and income that people are getting. So we spend, in fact, recently in the media, a lot of time talking about wages, right? About minimum wages, about living wages. And that is an important part of the housing affordability challenge. The other piece, the housing cost, is, as Daryl knows, it's complicated, right? The cost of construction and land and the development process is a little bit harder to wrap our hands around that cost piece of the affordability challenge. And that may be another reason why it's been harder to gain traction.
Well, I would just, two comments. One is that when you look at, when someone wants to build an apartment property in a community, you have homeowners that come out and they say, we don't want apartments in this community, which, apartments, notwithstanding, I think, the benefits of home ownership, but they're more efficient environmentally. They provide greater concentration of services and things like that. I mean, but you have opposition in certain communities where it may take 7 years to get a project approved because you have this outcry in many communities against apartments, and that has slowed the supply. I also think, and to the point of there are people today that choose to rent because it just makes better sense for them. And while I understand the home ownership rate that we want, there are benefits for people buying, there are also great benefits for people renting. And I think one of the reasons why the rental market is so strong today is because people, even some millennials, they see that their parents' fortune was wiped out in the housing market, and they don't want the same thing, number one. And number two, there's a great mobility in this country today. If you're willing to move, you probably can find better opportunities, and very often home ownership, keeps a person, at a particular location.
It used to be, we had a conversation about, we had a concept of a ladder to home ownership in this country. And the ladder was all about, and to your point, the ladder was all about affordable rentals. Without those rungs, you couldn't climb up. I appreciate the point. We have a second question here from Twitter, and I want to stick with you, Daryl, if I could, and then turn to Lisa. And that is, how do we solve the crisis? So how do you think about the most important responses to the affordability crisis on the rental side? How much of it is it about expanding supply? What's the role of federal rental assistance, which largely operates on the demand side? At least the housing vouchers are the best known, the biggest program. But what are the pieces, do you think, of a solution? Well,
certainly, there are government pieces like the low-income housing tax credit and vouchers and Section 8 that certainly, if you look at those two programs, they provide about 4.5 million rentals, and we are underserved by probably 9. The number is just out. They get crazy, but we are underserved by. We have much greater demand than that. So that's one tool. The other is actually more supply, and what's interesting about that, creating new rentals. I mean, in that map with the burdens, I mean, while everyone is focusing on the coast, and one of the reasons why the apartment market is so strong, and getting back to the point made about investors want to invest in apartments on the two coasts. It's interesting. I'm originally from Detroit, and we operate and we own and manage in Michigan. And you see this big block that's dark in Michigan, and you see around Chicago, and even down in Indiana, we own in Indianapolis. One of the biggest challenges in the state of Michigan, even though if you pull up a vacancy rate, you'll see that it's 8% or 10% vacant, but so many properties are obsolete, and we lose 100,000 units a year. And you take a place like that, it is hard to find a nice apartment in a good neighborhood. So, you know, the burdens are in places that you would think would be, okay, why is that? But, you know, it's because there hasn't been additions to supply. And one of the reasons, you know, investors are not lining up to invest in the center part of the country. They all want to be on the two coasts.
Lisa, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I would add to that. I think there are two important things that the government can do to help alleviate the problem of housing burden on the rental side. And I say that because government can't do this by itself. But to Daryl's point about federal subsidies for housing, right now federal programs reach about 1 out of 4 households eligible for rental assistance. And so in this era where we're shrinking resources for housing support, we have to keep that in mind, that 3/4 of the folks that are eligible to receive a housing voucher, to receive a unit in a public housing, aren't being served. I would argue that the low-income housing tax credit program, it's really important to keep that on our radar screen. It is the primary means by which affordable rental housing gets built. And it is in the discussion of a larger tax reform. So it's a program that it has very popular support on both sides. And so as that conversation goes on, it's important that that program remain and be expanded so that we can have opportunities to build. But I would argue the federal government is sort of not where it's at right now. Innovation in getting affordable housing built is really happening at the local level. And so the extent to which zoning rules are relaxed to allow more residential construction, that has got to be part of the solution. And you know, relaxing zoning requirement is almost a free subsidy, right? It doesn't cost anything but land or air, right, if you're going up. And to the extent possible, without slowing overall residential demand, to tie affordability requirements to new residential construction through inclusionary housing programs like they're doing, expanding in New York, like they do in over 500 communities across the country, is also a critical way that the local government can help alleviate the cost burden problem.
So different levels of government have roles to play.
Absolutely.
Chris?
So I just want to kind of frame it a little bit, because I think that we talk about assisted housing and we talk about market rate housing, and I think that it's important for people to kind of have some numbers in their head when we're talking about. So if you look at the distribution of incomes across renters, about 1/4 of them make $15,000 a year and less, which is equivalent to working year-round at full-time at the minimum wage. So if you're out there, you got a full-time job, you know, you're working in a hotel or a restaurant, then comes time to pay your monthly rent check, and you're going to meet that 30% of affordability standard. It works out to about $400 a month. So what we're talking about is, you know, can the private market provide housing at that level? And you talk about the things Daryl was talking about earlier in terms of land costs, building costs, labor costs, financing costs, putting these deals together. That's a bridge too far in many cases for the private sector to do. So there's definitely going to be a case where we have to have subsidies for people who are, you know, doing the best they can, but just given the way our markets function, they can't get there. You know, then we go from there to about $30,000 is the median renter household income. So that's a range of about $400 to $800 in a month in rent. Private sector might be able to get there, but as you know, Lisa and Daryl talked about, they're going to need some help. They're going to need some help to make sure we can control those costs. So I think there's a range of responses needed, but when we're talking about the bottom, and that's what, you know, the 1/4 of people who are eligible, we're talking about people at the bottom who are eligible, who get assistance. We're really not doing enough for that group who left the private market alone aren't going to be able to find something that's affordable.
But Chris, given your point, sort of outlining the distribution of incomes, and the point Lisa made earlier, about the income side of the equation, not just the cost side of the equation, it would seem to underline the importance of the debate, really, about the minimum wage, labor standards. I think we've seen over the last year or so the emergence of a different kind of narrative about that. It used to be it was all about raising the minimum wage would be a job killer. I mean, that's been arguably a 20, 30-year narrative in this country. Very hard to even talk about moving it, even though it's been stuck, not inflation adjusted, for a long time, as you all know. We've seen the emergence of, I'm with the Ford Foundation, I'll invoke Mr. Ford for a second, the old Henry Ford argument, I pay my workers more so they can afford my cars. We've seen the emergence of that argument about what it does for consumer demand when people have a little more take-home pay. And you're making another point, it seems to me, on the panel today about being able to afford really just basic rental housing to help support the market. We've had income stuck for a long time, especially on the bottom. And that's something we shouldn't lose sight of. Wherever you line up on the issue, it's important to make that connection. I want to stick on rentals for just a moment here, because there's another figure, statistic, in the report that's really striking. 60% of the increase in rental housing units since 2006, Daryl, have come in the form of single-family homes being rented out. and institutional investors have moved into this segment in a big way for the first time. Is that presence in the single-family rental market here to stay? And what does it mean going forward?
Well, it's always been a segment of the market. It's been 10 to 15 to even 20% of the entire rental market has been served in single family. I think the institutional ownership is what's new about it. And I would just, two comments about that. One is the single family market is an extension of what I see with our larger units, 3 and 4 bedrooms. There's demand for family rentals that, either through economic reasons or for choice, they want to rent. Now, the real challenge will be, and Lisa and I talked about this earlier, when we're building all these new apartments in urban areas, downtown LA and other places, when people, and maybe the tech worker who is 27 years old, the question will be what happens when they get married and then they start having kids, and then 10 years later, or 5 years later, their kids start in school. One of the interesting things, and I'm on the board of one of the companies that has gone public, they really bought very well. They bought some of the best school districts, and when they have a property that they put on the market, people flood to it because they want to be in that school district. And I don't think that we've done enough in whether it's rental or for sale, to align our new apartments with schools that will support them, because what happens is people will tend to move when they have school-age children.
Mm-hmm. We've got another question here from Twitter. I want to segue to back to homeownership for a moment. And the question, Mike, is: do you foresee a greater role for state housing finance agencies in meeting the financing needs of first-time homebuyers in particular?
A very good question, and often overlooked in the affordable home ownership debate. But again, I think the big message is that the state housing finance agencies have continued to provide credit through the crisis, and their homeowners had great success holding on to their homes through the crisis, which I think brings up again this point that there are a lot of incentives if you have an affordable mortgage payment that doesn't jump up in price for people to do virtually everything they can to stay in the house, because they're going to have to pay housing expense even if they leave. They're going to have to rent. It's not like you can leave and not pay any housing expense. So I do think there will be more emphasis there, that is one of the success stories that has not really gotten its due as we've gone through this crisis. But still, most borrowers are going to come through, if you will, the main window, which right now are Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac loans that they get through their local banks or mortgage banker and then are sold there. So I think the housing finance agencies will continue to be very important, and particularly for reaching the lower income borrowers who sometimes need subsidies for down payments or either special provisions there. But to move this whole market, we have got to open up the credit box in the main market as well.
And Mike, while we're on this theme, I want to ask you about the recovery in home prices and the slower recovery we've seen in minority communities in particular. So I guess start with a general question, how widespread has the recovery in home prices been? And are there neighborhoods, are there submarkets, if you will, being left behind?
Answer is a broad recovery if you look at metropolitan areas in general. I think the report notes that last year house prices were up in 97 of the top 100 metropolitan areas, so broad there. But when you look smaller at communities, communities of color have had both much higher foreclosures there, and then not surprisingly, they've had slower recoveries there just because of the effect of those depressed prices and vacancies within those neighborhoods. And then on top of that, those communities have been hit hardest economically in the recession as well. So you've seen the household income in those communities stressed more so than it has overall, and what's an overall tough recovery.
I do think it's important, Zob, to keep that point in mind, because we have a tendency to look at those top-line national numbers and not think about how this is playing out at the local level. And there's a risk, I think, that we pull back from efforts to try to address these issues that people are still wrestling with. That in minority communities, the report cites the degree of people being underwater is several times that in predominantly white communities. And so if we're thinking about principal reduction efforts or the like, we have to keep in mind that this is still an issue that's really prevalent in many communities across the country.
Mm-hmm. Point taken. And I want to ask you, while we're talking to you, I want to ask you about older Americans. We've talked a good deal about millennials here today for given reasons, but I know the Joint Center is doing more work on the aging of the population as well. And again, let me start with a broad question, starting with you, Chris. How will the housing market have to adapt to the rapid rise in older Americans? What jumps out for you?
Well, so we talk about the fact that over the next 10 years, we're going to see people age 70 and over. This is as the leading edge of the baby boomers get to that point. It's going to go up by 8.3 million over 10 years. And that's, against the backdrop of overall household growth of about 11 or 12 million. So a huge share of growth is going to be among older Americans. Now, not to conflate that with people who are forming new households and looking to buy. Most of those people are going to be looking to age in place. They're in houses, they're in communities that they like to stay. Some will move, and there will be some demand for housing in certain locations where people move, but for the most part, they're going to stay in place. So the implications for the housing market and for us as a society really are a couple. One is that in terms of staying in place, they're probably going to be looking to modify their homes to deal with the changes in physical abilities and the like as you age. But there's a broader set of issues that really intersect with housing, and I think we like to think of housing as being kind of the linchpin to a number of key issues, and one of them is finances. Particularly among older people, housing can eat up a big portion of your limited budget. So if you don't have housing that's affordable, it's going to have big implications for how much you have left over to spend on things like food and health care. And again, the issues in terms of making sure you're safe and secure in your home, making sure your house is modified to your abilities. But it also has to do with whether or not you're able to connect with your community. As people become less mobile, and most of these older Americans are suburbanized, and so they're going to be in their homes, and we need to make sure that the community has the kind of transportation and other supportive services that can keep people engaged with their community and not have the issue of isolation that becomes common among older folks. And then lastly, there's going to be a growing need for people to have healthcare services and other supportive services that integrate with their home. We have to find ways to be able to deliver those services affordably to people where they are. And if they can't, then we have to have other types of housing that can do that. So, I think this is a huge issue, both for individuals to plan ahead and for society, but governments at all levels to really start to take into account, because this is an issue that's going to be broad brushed. And so we don't spend a lot of time on it in this report because, as you mentioned, we have a major report coming out September 2nd. We're going to be releasing that, and so we'll really give this issue the attention that it deserves.
But the preview you're giving us is big numbers overall.
Big numbers overall.
Different choices here. Some people, of course, will be in nursing homes, assisted living. That's one kind of growth area. But a lot of aging in place.
A lot of aging in place.
Need to work that out. My wife and I take care of our parents in our own home. That's also a choice for some families. And I think we're seeing more and more models of support, of home care.
That's right.
And a lot of folks are thinking about what that means in the wake of healthcare reform as well.
We do see home builders who are starting to think about that and in creating more kind of granny flats within their houses. And again, it gets back to some of the zoning issues we talked about. To what extent does local zoning allow for that kind of intergenerational households living together? And it's something we need to think about as a community to really foster that, because it's really nice to have those generations be able to be together, but we have to make sure that the housing allows for that.
Before I do a last call here, Darryl, Lisa, Mike, any reflections on aging and on the importance of having an age lens as we think about these big housing patterns?
Well, I would just say that we own 6 over 55 communities that are affordable, and a lot of demand for that. And most of the decisions to rent there are to be close to where their children live. So if they're in a community where there's active entry-level housing, they seem to work a lot. There's a much stronger demand in those properties that are adjacent to where families live.
Yeah, and I would just add to that issue of aging and healthcare. And I feel like with the with the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid expansion, there's these opportunities to combine housing and health services in innovative ways at the state level that haven't been available in the past. And we're sort of just at the beginning edge. Some communities in Los Angeles, for example, are finding ways to do this so that they can sort of shift money from health to housing. But I would argue that the needs are going to be very different. You're going to have places in cities that are so-called these naturally occurring retirement communities where folks are aging in place in an apartment building, and that provides opportunities to bring services, health services to folks as they age in place. As you mentioned, the suburban model is quite different, where you have people who may not be as connected to family and to services as they could be. And then these are issues we covered in a recent report. In rural areas, what we're finding is that they're bringing services to people, right? So they're partnering with places like universities and health centers who are driving RVs to people's homes to provide health checkups. So I think this is just an example of where the need is going to be so great, and that innovation is really going to be key.
Really helpful. Mike, any thoughts on that?
The numbers show that a lot of older households who are homeowners have their homes paid for. Not surprisingly, but the trends are very disturbing in that direction, in that many more families are aging with very large mortgage balances. And to go to Chris's point, the numbers then just don't work out. If your housing costs stay fixed at a relatively high level, but your income's coming down substantially, it quickly becomes unaffordable. And I think it's other reasons why the trend towards more standardized 30-year fixed-rate mortgages is important, that the House is seen as part of that overall planning. I mean, one of the things we haven't talked as much about is the home equity lending. During the boom, home equity lending was a huge driver of consumer expenditure, and it juiced up the economy, if you will. And some of it now is we've got this hangover that if you take out that huge housing stimulus that was not sustainable there, and you see that play out also here in particular for the older households who hit retirement and don't have a mortgage they can afford.
So really important to include this in overall financial planning and thinking about the financial needs of older Americans. I think you're fingering the predictability of that fixed rate mortgage in the bigger equation. I know I read more and more concern about retirement security overall. I think a piece of it is the wake of the financial crisis, what happened to 401ks and the stock market for a while, of course, but concerns about, is my Social Security, is my 401k going to be enough? We've seen a broad shift off of the kind of pension-based social contract, if you will, into a brave new world. And there are folks who are nervous, and they're wondering whether the stock market will have the yields over the long term to generate the income they need in those elder years.
Yes.
But you're underscoring some troubling trends, it sounds like, when it comes to at least some segment of households that maybe took out a home equity loan or otherwise took on some extra debt at a point where their income is maybe coming down and flat.
Yes. And now they fall within this general sort of common sense rule that lenders are supposed to look and see, can people afford the mortgage payments over the life of the loan?
We have a tendency, I think, to extrapolate from the kind of conditions that people who are in their 70s now to say that's what we're looking forward to. But if you pointed out, I mean, the people who are now in their 50s are facing a very different path than people who are now retired. And we talked a lot about how millennials have been set back from their experience during this recession. I think the group that I also worry a tremendous amount about are people in their 50s, because that's the group that's starting to get to retirement. Time is running out. Many lost their homes to foreclosure. Others have had to refinance in order to make ends meet. They didn't put away enough money for retirement. And to Mike's point, I think when they get into the retirement ages and they're still carrying that housing burden, they don't have much savings, they're going to be in a much difficult situation. One of the outcomes of this report, people always say, what did you find surprising when you do a report? And oftentimes, we study these things, and so it's not too much surprising to us. But when we did this report that we'll talk about more in September, a lot of us sort of looked at our mortgage situation and said, we better make sure that we don't hit our retirement with a mortgage, because we talk a lot about the value of homeownership in terms of wealth creation, but that dividend of living rent-free in your retirement is probably the biggest financial benefit of that wealth, because people don't cash in that wealth until the end of life, but they live off that dividend for much of their retirement.
Really important reminder for everybody. It's a bit of a sobering note that we're ending on. But, the report is full of really encouraging news, too, about the overall continued recovery of the housing market, which is fantastic for so many reasons. I want to thank our terrific panelists, Chris and Daryl and Lisa and Mike, for joining us today, and thank all the viewers and members of the audience as well. I want to remind our online viewers you can continue the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag Harvard Housing Report. And you can download the report and also check out interactive maps, play with the data a little bit on the Joint Center's website. It's www.jchs.harvard.edu. Thank you again to all of our speakers and to all of you, and have a great afternoon.